I want you to walk away from this session with a bunch of practical stuff that you can do with your class about inflation the next time you see them. So everything that I'm going through is really anchored in the theory and the macro. Lots of links to what Thomas has said, but stuff that you can get your kids doing that is very hands-on and exploring inflation. So in terms of the structure, that looking at an RBA board activity, types of inflation, overview of what's going on at the moment. I've interspersed past HSC questions, sorry for the New South Wales bias, but I think that the concepts will extend across jurisdictions as well. So congratulations to you all. You are now sitting on the RBA board. It's a much larger board, a much broader board in terms of encouraging teachers on board. And so let's say that you face this situation, right? You're sitting down and you look at things, and as Thomas was saying, you know, CPI in yearly terms is very important for the RBA board. So we look at the CPI and we say, okay, so it's gone up by 3.3% the year to the March quarter, 3.6% the year to the June quarter, and 3.5% the year to the September quarter. So presenting you with this information that even before you start extending beyond it, you can sort of think, okay, so we're sitting outside of this target band. And then what we can think about is that, all right, you've got this information. What do you need? Well, what do we know? What is this actually telling us? But I think more importantly, in encouraging students to think, what else do we need to know? If this is what we're sitting at, what other questions would be useful for us to ask? What I mean in terms of that is being able to say, yes, okay, CPI in yearly terms is sitting outside of the RBA's target band, but does this mean that the cash rate should rise? So are we applying the strict formula that, outside target band, cash rate's got to rise? In terms of what information we might need as RBA board members, as students studying economics, what is causing this inflation, right? We are sitting outside the target band, but why? What's the specific cause? How serious or persistent is this cause? And if we attack this inflation with the change in monetary policy, what could be the flow-on effects through the economy? Will this be helpful in terms of addressing the source? Could this have unintended consequences? So it's asking students to sit with it, and we're not looking for precise, we're not looking for exact answers. We're just looking about, okay, what are the questions we need to ask? What are the things we need to think about? Because if you have a bunch of students that are saying, yep, no problems, cash rate needs to rise because that's the best way to address inflationary pressures and have that kind of bit of macro theory down, what you can say is that actually this bit of inflation was caused by the cyclones in 2011, right? You can actually go point to it and say, look at that. This bit of inflation was caused by the fruit and veg prices, particularly fruit prices. And you can see there 14.5% in that March quarter, 26.9% in the June quarter, but a decline going into that October quarter. And so what you're trying to get at here is we're not just looking at the inflation number. We're trying to go a little bit deeper and figure out what is the cause, what should be the course of action. So that the specific things you might push with students are, that inflation figure, is that headline or underlying? Because it was headline. And you can say to students, there is a risk in just judging inflation based on the headline, because if we exclude the volatile components, what does that tell us? What does that give us that the overall measure doesn't? The other thing you can talk about is that, is this something, based on what we've been studying in class, that the RBA should act on, or should it look through it? And what I mean by that, in terms of the last point there, that yes, contractionary monetary policy is powerful, but can it make the crops grow? Right? If we increase the cash rate to deal with inflationary pressures caused by fruit prices, where does that leave us? And that it's having students think about, maybe that's not the solution here. That maybe we need to see what the headline is, check that with the core, and then look at it in terms of what is the appropriate policy response. And I guess what this is useful if we think about it, if we are faced with these pressures in one part of Australia and we increase the cash rate across the whole economy, what does that do? Is that the appropriate response? Is that what we should actually do? So that when we think about these two time periods, right? So I've got the time period of the cyclones and our banana prices, and then I've got the current time period. What I would draw your attention to is that the light blue line is the headline CPI. And what you can see is that, yes, the headline CPI was rising at the banana prices, but check out what was happening to the underlying measures that the RBA looks at. Trim mean, weighted median on their way down. If we make judgments based on the headline, we might make some policy mistakes. Because if you think about it, if we raise cash rate and then 6 to 18 months later we have the impact, and we're not even dealing with the root cause, where does that leave us? You can see that if you compare it with students and you say, check out right now, yes, the headline is increasing, but so is underlying. So you can actually point out to students and you say, it makes sense in both a macroeconomic way and also a kind of pragmatic economy way, why we are responding to these things in different ways. So rather than saying you should always look past headline, is there a way of using a hands-on activity to say, this is why we look past headline, right? We can't make bananas grow based on contractionary monetary policy. It's a very powerful tool, but it can't do all of those kinds of things. And that you could find a different example in terms of other things that might be relevant to your students to have that contrast between headline, underlying, and this idea that, yes, the news will tell you about headline inflation, 5.1% and all of those things, but that when the RBA is making its decisions, what is it looking at? From my perspective, I think that if students can make a distinction in their work, in our HSC, the short answers or the essays, between headline and core, make that sort of point that yes, there is headline, but when we strip out the volatiles, then we get some underlying trends and some instruction on policy. I think that helps students stand out in terms of their responses as well, because it's sort of saying, I understand that there are these types of inflation, but then I understand the link between the policy tools as well. Okay, so that's one thing to start with. All right, I'm going to put you to work on this next question. Some of you may have seen it before, but you've got my answers on the next slide. That's okay. That's okay. But this is a question from the 2009 New South Wales HSC that is extraordinarily confusing to students, and so much so that I don't think I've seen them ask this question again since 2009. And what I really like about this question is it is a practical discussion of all the things that Thomas was talking about in terms of weighting, right? Because I could say to someone, oh, all things are weighted differently, but in terms of saying to students, what does it actually mean? So when you look at this, right, a lot of students will say, okay, well, this is really easy. Health has gone up by the most, right? Health has gone up by the most. And you're like, okay, cool, that's wrong. And then you go back and you say, the CPI, all things are not measured, well, all things are not weighted equally, right? It's changing, that they're modified, that it's based on what is happening. And so what it's saying to students is that, okay, so if we've got the inflation rate, so 20%, 10%, 50% on that side, but then we think about it, we incorporate the weighting on that we're starting to get a different kind of understanding here. So we're able to say that yes, there is that increase in inflation, but if it is weighted to that extent, what is the overall impact? And for those different categories, right? So you can modify it, you can put it in a way that might make sense for you and your students. But this idea that just because one group has an increase in prices doesn't mean it's going to have the biggest impact on things for consumers. So I find this a really useful activity, one that gets students quite frustrated initially, but this idea that what is the question looking for? What are the components of the question? Nothing is ever included in an exam that is not deliberate in terms of the questions or the stimulus. And even in going back to the question itself, looking at part A, which expenditure group contributed most? So thinking about, okay, so there's all these spending categories and things we keep track of, but the point is, how much is it contributing to the overall basket of goods and inflation in general? So in doing those calculations, that would be the way that it would go. So I like that as an activity in that weighting category. If I can shift slightly, so we had to look at, you're on the board, you're making the decisions, and then now we're looking at types of inflation. And that, obviously in your classes, you will talk about things like demand pull, cost push, imported inflation, inflationary expectations, all of the things that are important and the syllabus requires. But then I think it's like, what does it look like in an economy? So my family was a user of Dinnerly, which is one of those meal prep kind of things. They give you all those pre-portioned things and ingredients for the week. And they sent us an email and they said that prices were going up. And I like this sort of language that they use. Why the change? You will have noticed the impacts of inflation this year, and we are not immune to these, okay? Our operating costs of fuel, transport, wages, and of course ingredients, we have to pass these on to our consumers. This is how the price will change. So it's saying, okay, great, consumers receive this. And then it's saying, okay, so tell us, what type of inflation does this relate to? And so it's sort of like asking students to go through, and even if they start by saying, I don't know, you're like, that's fine. Let's list the causes there. And you say, is it inflationary expectations? Well, it might be. Is it import inflation? Maybe there are elements to that. Is it demand pull? Probably not. Is it cost push? Okay. The one thing that I'm trying to get students to do in looking at this is to think about that the higher costs of resources then push up prices. And what I think that this example, you could get any example at the moment. You could go to your cafe, which might, like mine, which is now charging higher coffee prices on the weekend only due to all, right. And so you could say or I read in the paper the other day that Domino's is increasing its fees. You could talk about KFC and lettuce, cabbage, that kind of stuff, whatever's relevant to your students. But you are saying that you are going to pay higher prices as a consumer because they are facing higher prices as a business. And then you work through and you say, can you identify all of the input costs that they have talked about? So one part is, what's the type of inflation? The second part, which I think is more interesting, is how did the factors in this lead to rising prices across the economy? So we're saying, okay, so Dinnerly faces higher fuel costs. Okay, how does that translate to higher costs for consumers? And in this as well, I think that there is a bit of, a tricky relationship in terms of aggregate supply. And I'm going off the New South Wales syllabus, so if it's slightly different, I apologise. But in terms of cost push, that we sort of talk about that decline in aggregate supply pushing prices up. But for here, in this example, it's not like Dinnerly is saying we're going to produce less or give you less. So I think it's providing that explanation that cost push, we're looking at what is happening for producers. How does that then feed into the prices that consumers actually pay? And I like this kind of thing. In terms of how you would do this, you could give them the article, you could talk it through them, you could do the first part, then ask them to do the second part individually. What I tend to do in my classes is I always like students to do stuff individually first, that to try and avoid the kind of like people dominating or people that don't usually contributing. And so even if they really struggle with it, it's saying that, no, I'm stepping out of the room. I don't, of course, duty of care, but I'm saying I'm not here, right? I don't want you to talk to your friends. I just want you to put something down. Yes, you can use dot points. Yes, you can use arrows, but I want you to do that. And then I would expand it out, maybe pairs, or then we would open up as a group and talk about, okay, so this happens, then this happens, and this happens. That results in Mr. Symonds paying more for his Dinnerly box every week. It's a kind of practical example of that type of inflation. The next one, which also has a interesting link in terms of fiscal policy as well, is that I think that some of the stimulus measures in terms of the budget and the coronavirus payments and things like that are also a useful way of demonstrating other types of inflation. So this is the one-off $250 payment. And so in terms of thinking about what does that relate to, and then giving a sense of, okay, so what are we doing? Well, we're giving a whole bunch of money to people that are receiving welfare. Okay, what does that count as? So we're increasing their incomes. What do we know about people that receive welfare? Okay, so generally, as a stereotype, that higher marginal propensity to consume. So if we give them $250, the understanding or the expectation is that a lot of that will be spent. And so you think about here, okay, if I increase consumption, let's remind ourselves consumption is part of that aggregate demand identity. Oh, this looks like demand pull inflation, right? So we're saying that yes, this is this fiscal policy measure, but it could contribute to demand pull inflation. And then asking students to talk about if we have all these people receiving cash handouts and they're spending, and that's going to accelerate consumption, then that's going to push inflation from the other way. So it's kind of like having that discussion about what does it actually look like in terms of the economy. So then if students get a question about sort of, analyze or explain trends in inflation or things like that, they could say, well, here's this policy and this could be contributing to demand pull inflation, draw the aggregate demand increase and that effect on prices as well. So these are some kind of practical examples that I like to use in terms of the types of inflation. The next example is a little bit more tricky, and I'll explain the types of questions that I've included here. So what I've got with these three things is levels in terms of questions, so that the bottom one would be the easiest. Not easy, but easiest. And then the top one would be the toughest. So what I'm trying to do with this graph is talk about imported inflation. So I've got the Australian dollar, and I'm saying that when the dollar was sort of near parity, what's that going to do in terms of Australia's inflation levels? When the dollar took a plummet, head down to 72, what's that going to do to Australia's inflation levels? So rather than saying, okay, define imported inflation and give an example, it's like, here's a bit of stimulus. Can you provide the interpretation of what would happen to the economy when the dollar changes in terms of inflation? So obviously saying, okay, dollar is weaker, imports more expensive. These are the kind of things that would happen. And what you can see is that I've kind of scaffolded or provided a bit of a framework to the responses. So if I think students are really going to struggle, I'm not going to give them the toughest question. That's difficult. But I might say is, okay, point A versus point B, at which point are imports more expensive? And why is that the case? And then saying, okay, so then if imports change in prices between those levels, where is imported inflation the highest? And then you could extend that in terms of talking about splitting out between consumers and businesses as well. So it's kind of trying to put it in a sort of practical setting in case they got a bit of stimulus and they were asked to provide this level of interpretation. I think this is a difficult ask in terms of students, but something that they can be capable of, but it's in terms of the way that it's presented as well. All right, let's take a small exam break here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a few minutes to answer this question. You can work with the person next to you if you trust them. What I would like you to do though is when I'm teaching this in class and you get those, the categories with the double barrel categories, what I ask students to do is do a really thick line between the columns, like an exaggerated thick line, and stick to the easiest one first. So for you, you're going to draw a really thick line between the columns and you're only going to focus on the left-hand side. Okay? If you're interested in unemployment, you should have chosen the other talk. So what I want you to do is, could you focus on that left-hand side, look at what the stats have been provided, and then which could be the possible answer, why, which would be the incorrect answers and why. So when I ask students this, I'm not asking them to identify the correct answer and move on. I'm asking them to provide some kind of explanation around it. It's very funny when you do this and students say, well, it's the right answer. That's the reason why. And you're like, that's fine. Now provide some kind of explanation to it. So I'll give you a few minutes. Could you could you provide the information? Which are the possible answers on the left-hand side and why? Which ones don't add up? And a bit of explanation. Go for it. Okay, I'm just going to bring you all back. It's okay if you haven't got there all the way there. One thing that I would do with students when I got a question like this and going through it in class is I would say, because I just overheard it being discussed here, is to look at the stimulus that you've been provided and look at what have they included to try and trick you, right? What are the red herrings in terms of the stimulus? And that you guys correctly identified that the population there is very much something that's designed to confuse students. So what I would do is if I'm going through this with students is I would say, please just cross that out. Like we know that we don't have calculations in the HSC course that are looking at population that's included there. It's very much there to trick them in terms of the unemployment calculations. If we just focus on the CPI, based on the numbers we've got, what has happened to the CPI in the economy? Increased? Yeah, so it's increased. Okay, so then we've got these reasons for the change in the CPI. In terms of A, what did we think? So it's possible? Why is it possible? Right. Right. So we've got a reduction in the cash rate, have a stimulatory effect on the economy, boost the components of aggregate demand. Yes, that could be a reason. That could be a cause of inflation. Because the other thing I would talk about is, are we looking at cause or effect here? Best accounts for the changes, we're looking at what has caused this. B, what do we think? No, why not? Right. So if the Australian dollar goes up, right, in terms of that, the imports would become cheaper. We would likely see a reduction in inflation. Does that seem okay? Increase in import tariffs, what do we think? Yeah? Possible? So the imports become more expensive? Great, imported inflation. And there you can show them when we have these protection measures, if people still buy imports, which is likely because we don't make the stuff that we import, that it could still be inflationary. D, what do we think? Right, increase in consumer confidence, how would that link to inflation? Demand, right, more spending, demand pull. Can you see that by doing this process, we've eliminated one response? That's excellent, right? I tell my students, if you can get it to a 50-50 with a multiple choice, that's outstanding, right? Improve your odds here. And then obviously on the next side, you would try and figure that out. But what you could do is make it even more structured way, is you could redo the question, just focus on inflation, the CPI part, and create little boxes where they have to write, is A a possibility, yes or no? What is your justification? Is B a possibility, yes or no? What is your justification? I like that question. That's from the 2020 HSC. There's always a question like this in the New South Wales exam. Okay, let's go to the last part of the discussion and then I'll open it up to questions as well. I think that at the moment, obviously, given that we're talking about inflation, it's extraordinarily topical, but I think that there are lots of good examples and information that we can show students about trying to understand what is actually happening with inflation, and then what are the implications for monetary policy. So for example, if we think back to our banana example, and we pulled out what was happening to the CPI, that because the underlying trend that it was not increasing, that we would see a lot of things staying stable or declining, except for fruit prices. What is interesting about the moment is how broad some of the price increases we are seeing across the board, right? In looking at this, you can see that food and alcoholic beverages, clothing and footwear is falling, and Thomas gave us a good explanation about why that's happening. Housing in terms of rents, transport, yes, there is a bunch in terms of petrol, and that's something that we need to talk about as well, and also in terms of education. So that in presenting this to students and saying that, yes, okay, your parents will be complaining about petrol prices, and in fact, you guys might be complaining about petrol prices, But the RBA is not increasing the cash rate to deal with rising petrol prices. That it is much broader in terms of what we are seeing in the economy. That giving students some sense that when they are discussing inflation, that it is a broad-based experience, not just a couple of categories that are rising. So this comes from the ABS and can be worth giving to students in a sense of, here are the main groups. What can we see from this? What's the difference between the quarterly and annual performance as well? Because you can see that some of the annual increases are quite strong as well, not just the quarterly stuff. But this kind of builds to a broader point and links in with what Thomas was saying. And that is the sense that I really encourage my students to look past the headline figure. Yes, I want them to know what it is, but I think that they can demonstrate their economic knowledge a bit more strongly by saying that, yes, we can look at the broad-based stuff, but what we should do is exclude some of those volatile components. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this exists on the RBA's website, that they give you very easily. You can see that the measures that they pay attention to as well, and there's a lot of explanation about the trim mean, and there's also the weighted median there. So you can see the all group CPI, the headline, and then you can see that back in a different lifetime, I used to work at the Financial Review, and we would call these the RBA's preferred measures. That was the preferred way of explaining them. But for your students, you could talk about the RBA's measures of underlying inflation, I think would be suitable. And that what you're showing is that you're showing the examiner, you're showing whoever's looking at the work, that you understand the issues with headline inflation and the importance of underlying. And what I think you can see really clearly at the moment is that whether we look at headline or underlying, we are outside of the target band. And this is giving justification and reasoning as to why we are seeing movements in monetary policy in terms of the students' experience of matching up the theory with what is happening in the economy at the moment. So I think that this stuff is really powerful. I spend a lot of time talking about core inflation and probably less time talking about headline. I think that with your point about anchoring expectations and the importance of headline to consumers, I might even up the balance a bit, because you can see the experience for consumers in reading about prices rising by 5.1%, even versus say 3.7, that psychologically would feel very differently. So that's kind of a practical part, and that you could present those two things. You say, here are the headline figures, here are the core figures. You need to be aware of these, and that what is driving policy decisions is looking at what are the underlying trends. And that as we can see from this experience, that there are broad increases in terms of inflation, and that's helping students with that. I think for me, it would be enough that they understood the categories and some of the relative increases. I don't think I would need to drill down sort of intensely in terms of what makes up that for a student response. But if they can talk about that, the March quarter CPI did this, here were some of the main measures, core inflation is doing this, this is as a result the RBA has increased the cash rate, that's a pretty good understanding and link between theory and reality in terms of things. So those were the kind of things to very much talk about. In terms of me, you can, if you have further questions, things you want to follow up, things you want to clarify, resources that you're interested in, I'm very happy to share and help. This is a real passion of mine as well.